The Train to Platform 13.5, a Walter Bramble story. Chapter 1, The Hidden Platform. Before we begin, do make yourself comfortable. Settle down, pull the blanket a little higher if you have one, and let the day loosen its grip. If you enjoy Walter Bramble's quiet adventures, you may wish to subscribe so you can find the next story when it arrives. Now, let us step softly into the library. Walter Bramble had always believed that rain made a town more truthful. Sunshine had a way of making everything show off. Windows glittered. Shop signs looked more confident than they had any right to be. Even pigeons strutted about as though personally responsible for the weather. But rain was different. Rain softened the edges of things. It made people hurry, made lampposts shine, and made old brickwork smell faintly of pennies and moss. It tapped on umbrellas like a patient finger. It gathered in the cracks of paving stones and showed exactly where the road dipped, where the gutter leaned, and where Mr. Pottle from the bakery had once dropped a sack of flour and never quite scrubbed it away. On that particular Thursday, the rain was not heavy. It was the thin, silvery sort that seemed to hang in the air rather than fall through it, as if the clouds had mislaid their enthusiasm halfway down. Walter stood in his hallway and considered the weather through the frosted glass of his front door. "Not exactly heroic," he said to no one in particular, "but damp enough to deserve a hat." He took his tweed flat cap from the peg, gave it a firm shake, and placed it on his head at what he considered a thoughtful angle. From the small table beside the door, he picked up his notebook. It was a soft brown notebook, worn smooth at the corners. It had belonged to his wife, Eleanor, who had once filled its first pages with favourite lines from poems, observations about birds, and one rather severe recipe for marmalade that Walter had never dared attempt. These days, Walter added his own remarks in the spaces beside her handwriting. Some were sketches, some were thoughts, a few were reminders, though Walter had found that writing down "buy onions" did not always result in the buying of onions. He opened the notebook and read the line Eleanor had written many years before. "There are journeys that begin long before the road appears." Walter smiled. "Well," he said, tucking the notebook into his coat pocket, "that sounds like permission." The town library stood at the end of a narrow lane between the haberdasher's and a shop that sold lampshades, replacement buttons, and, for reasons never properly explained, wooden ducks. It was a modest building with arched windows and a green-painted door that stuck slightly in wet weather. Walter pushed it open with his shoulder. The bell above the door gave a small, surprised jangle. Inside, the library smelled of old paper, floor polish, wool coats, and the faint lemon scent of Mrs. Finch's hand cream. Walter considered it one of the finest smells in the civilized world. Mrs. Finch was behind the desk, repairing a torn dust jacket with the concentration of a surgeon. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bramble," she said without looking up. "Mrs. Finch," said Walter, "I see the rain has followed me in." "It often does. You have an understanding face." "I've always feared as much." She smiled and smoothed a strip of tape along the book's spine. Mrs. Finch was a small woman with silver hair pinned in a bun and spectacles that were never quite where one expected them to be. Sometimes they sat on her nose, sometimes on top of her head. Once Walter had found them in the gardening section, marking a page about turnips. "Anything in particular today?" she asked. Walter removed his cap and gave it a little shake near the mat. "I thought perhaps something with maps, or ruins, or a respectable amount of mystery, but nothing involving pirates before tea." Mrs. Finch looked up then. "Not pirates," she said. "No, I think not today." She glanced towards the back of the library. Walter followed her gaze. The far corner was where the older travel books lived, not the shiny modern guides with photographs of rooftop cafes and suspiciously cheerful people wearing linen, but the serious old volumes, county rambles, railway journeys, forgotten footpaths, canal histories, and guides to places that had either changed their names or quietly disappeared. "There's a book on the third shelf," said Mrs. Finch. "Blue cloth cover. No title on the spine." "That sounds willfully unhelpful." "Most useful books are at first." Walter narrowed his eyes. "Mrs. Finch, are you recommending a book or setting me a trap?" "That depends entirely on how curious you are." "Ah," said Walter. "A trap, then." He made his way past the reading tables, where a man in a brown cardigan had fallen asleep over the newspaper, one finger resting firmly on an article about turnip prices. A girl in red boots was whispering sternly to a stuffed rabbit. Near the window the rain tapped and traced thin lines down the glass. Walter reached the travel shelves and crouched slightly, which produced a sound from one knee like a small twig being snapped by a disappointed squirrel. "Steady," he muttered. The blue book was exactly where Mrs. Finch had said it would be. It had no title on the spine, no author, and no label from any known publisher. The cover was faded at the edges, and its cloth binding had the soft, tired feel of something that had been handled by many people in many moods. Walter slid it free. A folded paper slipped out and landed at his feet. It did not flutter like ordinary paper. It seemed to fall carefully, as though choosing the spot. Walter picked it up. It was an old railway timetable printed on cream card. The edges were soft with age, and the ink had faded to a blue-grey. Across the top, in elegant lettering, were the words, "Departures for unlisted stations." Walter blinked. "Well now," he whispered, "that's either marvellous or a clerical error." He unfolded it further. There were times listed in neat columns. Some of the stations had perfectly ordinary names: Northwick, Bramley Halt, Whistlebridge. Others were less ordinary. The Valley of Lost Afternoons, the junction of almost second chances, the Quiet Mile. And near the bottom, printed in smaller letters, was a departure that made Walter's fingers still. Platform 13.5, 7:17 p.m. One way until returned. Walter read it twice. Then a third time, because certain sentences behave badly unless watched closely. "One way until returned," he murmured. "That is not the sort of wording approved by a transport committee." He opened the blue book. Its pages were filled with descriptions of old railway lines, abandoned stations, private halts, forgotten branch routes, and little sketches of platforms overgrown with nettles. But every few pages, Walter noticed something odd. A station would be mentioned once, then never again. A map would show a line bending into a patch of blank countryside. A footnote would refer to passengers with unresolved tickets. One illustration showed a small waiting room with no door, only a clock, and beneath it someone had penciled, "Late travellers may still be expected." Walter felt a familiar sensation. It began at the back of his neck, just below the collar. Not fear, exactly. More the feeling one gets when a locked drawer is found slightly open. He took the book and timetable back to the desk. Mrs. Finch was now stamping returned books. Thump, thump, thump. Each stamp sounded oddly like a distant train wheel striking a joint in the track. "Mrs. Finch?" Walter said. "Yes, Mr. Bramble." "This book contains a timetable for impossible places." She took the timetable, examined it briefly and handed it back. "So it does. You don't seem concerned." "I rarely find concern improves a timetable." Walter looked at her carefully. "Have you seen this before?" Mrs. Finch's expression became mild in the way a locked gate is mild. "Some books are not borrowed in the usual manner." "That is not an answer." "No," said Mrs. Finch, "but it may be a useful beginning." Walter glanced again at the cream card. "Platform 13.5, he said. "There is no platform 13.5 at our station. Not during ordinary hours." Walter waited. Mrs. Finch adjusted the books on her desk into a tidier pile. "Not every journey is measured in miles," she said. Walter gave a small sigh. "Librarians," he said. "One asks for a simple explanation and receives embroidery." "Wear sensible shoes," said Mrs. Finch. "For embroidery?" "For journeys." At that moment, the clock above the library door ticked loudly. Walter looked up. It was just after 5. The train, if train it was, departed at 7:17. Outside, the rain had thickened. The windows were no longer merely streaked, but silvered, and beyond them the town had become a watercolour version of itself. Walter placed the timetable inside his notebook, between Eleanor's quotation and his sketch of a rook that looked more like an umbrella with opinions. He borrowed the blue book, though Mrs. Finch did not stamp it. "Doesn't it need checking out?" he asked. "Oh," she said, "I think it has checked you out." Walter decided not to ask what that meant. By 6:30, the town was slipping into evening. Shopkeepers turned their signs to closed. The bakery windows glowed yellow. Somewhere down a side street, a dog barked at a dustbin with deep personal conviction. Walter walked towards the old railway station. Not the modern stop on the edge of town with its glass shelter and electronic board that apologized for delays in a tone of smug indifference. This was the original station, closed decades earlier, half hidden behind a row of sycamores and a brick wall patched with ivy. As a boy, Walter had seen trains there, real trains, breathing steam, smelling of coal, iron, hot oil, and adventure. He remembered standing beside his father, wearing a scarf too long for him, watching a locomotive pull away while the platform trembled under his shoes. His father had said, "Every train goes somewhere, Walt. The trick is knowing whether you ought to be on it." Walter had thought that very wise at the time. Now, standing before the locked iron gates of the abandoned station, he thought it was possibly the sort of advice fathers gave when they had no idea either. The station was quiet. Rain ticked on dead leaves. Weeds grew between the paving stones. The old booking office stood dark and boarded, its roofline sagging slightly in the middle like a tired eyebrow. Walter checked his watch. 7 minutes past 7. "No platform 13, he said. "No platform half. No anything much, really." Then he heard it. A whistle. Very faint, very far away. Not the sharp whistle of a modern train, but a long, soft note that seemed to come through the rain rather than over it. Walter turned. At the far end of the brick wall, almost hidden behind elder bushes, was a narrow archway he was quite certain had not been there before. Above it hung a small brass sign. The letters were dark at first. Then, as Walter stepped nearer, they brightened one by one. Platform 13.5. Walter took off his cap, looked inside it as though expecting advice, then put it back on. "Well," he said quietly, "that's inconveniently persuasive." The archway was just wide enough for one person. Beyond it, a flight of steps led downwards, though Walter had always understood the old station to be entirely above ground. He placed one hand on the wall. The bricks were warm. That, he thought, was not normal for a wet evening. He descended. The steps curved gently, lit by lamps fixed to the wall in brass brackets. Each lamp contained a small blue flame, steady as a held breath. At the bottom, Walter emerged onto a platform. It was not ruined. It was magnificent. The platform stretched beneath a glass roof beaded with rain, though the rain made no sound here. Polished benches stood beneath old enamel signs. Porters' trolleys waited beside stacked leather trunks. A clock with Roman numerals hung above a doorway marked "Refreshments," although Walter could smell neither tea nor biscuits, which he considered a serious failing. Then the mist at the end of the platform began to glow. A green steam locomotive rolled silently into view. It was deep bottle green with brass fittings, red wheels, and a chimney that released soft curls of silver smoke. Its nameplate shone on the side. The Resolute Sparrow. Walter stared. "I was expecting something grander," he admitted. The engine gave a small hiss, almost offended. "No criticism intended," Walter added quickly. "Sparrows are very determined birds." The carriages behind it were old-fashioned, painted cream and green, with polished handles and small lamps glowing in each window. As the train came to a halt, a door opened. A conductor stepped down. He was tall and thin, with a dark blue uniform, a silver pocket watch, and eyebrows so precise they looked as though they had been measured before installation. "Mr. Walter Bramble," said the conductor. Walter tightened his grip on the notebook in his pocket. "That depends who's asking." "The train. Trains ask now, do they? Only the better ones." The conductor held out a gloved hand. "Ticket, please." Walter frowned. "I don't have a ticket." The conductor tilted his head. "Are you certain?" Walter reached into his coat pocket and found the timetable, but it had changed. The cream card had become thicker, smaller, and edged with silver. Across it, in ink as dark as midnight, were printed the words, Walter Bramble. Platform 13.5. Valid for one unfinished journey. Walter swallowed. I appear to have been organized without my consent. That is often how journeys begin, said the conductor. And where does this train go? To the places passengers meant to reach. That is a slippery answer. Most true ones are. Walter looked down the platform. The clock read 7:16. One unfinished journey, he said. What does that mean? The conductor glanced at the watch in his palm. It means, Mr. Bramble, that something remains unresolved. Walter thought of many small things. A letter he had never answered. A box in the attic he had not opened since Eleanor died. A promise to sort out the shed that had matured into a local legend. Unresolved is rather a wide category, he said. Indeed. The conductor stepped aside. All aboard. Walter hesitated. A sensible person he knew would go home. A sensible person would make toast, dry their socks by the radiator, and perhaps write a strongly worded note in their diary about suspicious railway practices. Walter had always respected sensible people. He had just never found their lives especially interesting. He stepped onto the train. The carriage smelled of polished wood, raincoats, old velvet, and steam. Lamps glowed above the seats. The upholstery was dark red, patterned with tiny golden leaves. A brass luggage rack ran overhead, holding hat boxes, umbrellas, a bird cage with no bird inside, and one object wrapped in brown paper that ticked faintly. Several passengers were already seated. Nearest the door sat an elderly man with a white beard and a navy coat, holding a lantern on his lap. The lantern was unlit, yet his face seemed brightened by it. Across from him was a woman with quick dark eyes and a leather case full of violin tools. Her hands were delicate and restless, as if shaping music even when empty. Further along sat a plump postmistress in a red cardigan, clutching a bundle of unopened letters tied with blue ribbon. And by the window, a boy of perhaps 16 turned a broken brass compass over and over in his hands. The needle spun continuously, unable to settle. Walter removed his cap. "Good evening," he said. The passengers looked up. The elderly man nodded first. "Evening." The violin maker gave a polite smile. The postmistress dabbed her nose with a handkerchief. The boy with the compass said, "Are you dead?" Walter blinked. "I sincerely hope not." "He asks everyone that," said the postmistress. "It's nerves. It's research," said the boy. Walter sat opposite him. "I am Walter Bramble, retired schoolteacher, amateur noticer of things, occasional victim of library recommendations." The elderly man chuckled. "Jonas Reed," he said, "lighthouse keeper, retired if tides allow such things." "Elspeth Vale," said the woman with the tool case, "violin maker." "Agnes Plover," said the postmistress, 38 years at the sorting office, never lost a parcel except the one shaped like a goose, and I maintain that was poorly wrapped." The boy looked at his compass. "Milo Quince," he said, "inventor." "What does it invent?" Walter asked. Milo looked offended. "It doesn't invent. I invent." The compass is supposed to find the direction of what you need most. Walter watched the needle spin. Busy, is it? It's broken. Or very honest. Milo frowned, perhaps deciding whether to be annoyed. The conductor appeared at the end of the carriage. Tickets, please. Each passenger produced one. Jonas's ticket smelled faintly of salt. Elspeth's had a line of music printed across it. Agnes's was folded like an envelope. Milo's was smudged with oil. Walter handed his over. The conductor clipped it with silver pincers. The tiny piece that fell away did not drop to the floor. It became a spark, floated upwards, and vanished near the lamp. Walter looked at the conductor. Does that happen in second class? There is no second class on this service. Very democratic. Very necessary. The conductor returned the ticket. Outside the window, mist pressed against the glass. The whistle sounded again, closer now, filling the carriage with a low, mournful sweetness. The train began to move. At first, Walter saw only the platform sliding past, the brass signs, the benches, the rainless glass roof, the clock. Then the platform was gone. The train entered silver mist. For a few moments there was nothing beyond the windows at all. Not darkness, not countryside, not tunnel, just a pale, moving brightness, as if the train were travelling through the inside of a pearl. Walter opened his notebook. Beside Eleanor's line about journeys beginning before roads appear, he wrote, 7:19 p.m., boarded impossible train. Conductor evasive but well-dressed. Engine sensitive about name. Must remember to ask if return tickets exist. He paused, then added, wear sensible shoes. Mrs. Finch annoyingly correct. Across the aisle, Jonas Reed polished the glass of his unlit lantern. First time? He asked. Walter looked up. On this particular impossible train, yes. They say you only get called when the thing you left behind starts calling louder than the life you're living. That sounds both poetic and troubling. Jonas smiled. Most things worth hearing are. Walter glanced at the others. Elspeth Vale had opened her violin case. Inside was no violin, only a single unfinished scroll of carved maple wood. Agnes Plover stared at her bundle of letters as though they might accuse her. Milo Quince held his compass tightly, watching its frantic needle. Walter wondered what each of them had left unfinished. Then he wondered more quietly what he had. The train gathered speed. Somewhere ahead, a bell rang once. A sign appeared outside the window, hanging in the mist with no post to hold it. Next, stop. The Valley of Lost Afternoons. Walter felt the carriage lean gently into a curve. In his pocket, Eleanor's notebook grew warm. He placed his hand over it. The train hurried on into the silver mist, carrying its passengers towards stations that should not exist, along tracks no map had ever dared admit. And Walter Bramble, who had only gone to the library because of a little rain, began to suspect that he had boarded exactly the train he was meant to find. Though he would have preferred, if anyone had asked him, just a little more notice. Chapter 2. Stations that shouldn't exist. The train did not rattle. Walter noticed this almost at once, because trains, in his opinion, ought to rattle at least a little. A train without a rattle was like a cat without suspicion. Technically possible, perhaps, but not entirely trustworthy. The resolute sparrow moved through the silver mist with a soft, steady hush. There was no clack of wheels on rails, no shriek around bends, no hollow thunder through tunnels, only the low breath of steam and the occasional murmur from the brass lamps above the seats. Walter tapped the carriage wall with one knuckle. "Too smooth," he said. Milo Quince looked up from his broken compass. "What is?" "This train. It's behaving like a thought." Milo considered that. "Maybe it is one." Walter gave him a sideways look. "Young man, if you intend to say mysterious things, you should do so sparingly. Otherwise, people start expecting it." Milo returned to his compass. The needle was still spinning. Across the aisle, Agnes Plover, the retired postmistress, had untied the blue ribbon around her bundle of letters. She had not opened any of them. She simply held them in her lap and smoothed their edges, again and again, as though trying to flatten 38 years of worry. Jonas Reed, the lighthouse keeper, polished his lantern with a square of cloth. Elspeth Vale rested her violin-maker's case on her knees, one hand placed carefully over the unfinished curl of maple wood inside. Walter opened his notebook. The page felt warmer than it should have done. Eleanor's old handwriting sat at the top, calm and certain. There are journeys that begin long before the road appears. Underneath, Walter had written his own notes from the previous hour. He added, "Train unnaturally smooth, passengers carrying problems in portable form, possible danger of symbolism." He underlined symbolism twice, because he had always felt it could get above itself if not kept in order. The conductor appeared at the end of the carriage. He moved without swaying, though the train had begun to bend through invisible curves. "Approaching first stop," he said. "The Valley of Lost Afternoons. Passengers are reminded to take only what belongs to them, and to leave behind anything they have been carrying too long." Agnes made a small sound. Jonas stopped polishing his lantern. Milo's compass needle spun faster. Walter leaned towards the conductor. "Is there a leaflet for this journey?" "No." "A safety announcement?" "No." "A biscuit trolley?" The conductor paused. "No." Walter sat back. "Civilization declines by inches." The mist outside the window thinned. At first, Walter saw only shapes. Then a hillside appeared, sloping gently beneath a sky the color of old honey. Long grass moved in a breeze that did not reach the train. A narrow platform came into view, made from pale stone and edged with wildflowers. A sign stood beside a wooden bench. "The Valley of Lost Afternoons." The train slowed. This time there was a sound, one soft sigh, as if the engine had remembered something sad. The carriage door opened. Jonas Reed stood. His hand tightened around the lantern. "I believe this is mine," he said. Walter looked at him. "Your stop." Jonas nodded. "I hoped it wouldn't be." People rarely pack for the things they hope to avoid. Jonas gave a small smile. "That sounds like something a school teacher would say." It is. We keep such remarks in reserve. The conductor stepped onto the platform and looked back. Mr. Reed. Jonas moved towards the door. At the last moment, he turned to the others. If I don't come back. You will, said the conductor. Jonas looked at him. Changed? Possibly. Worse? That depends on what you leave behind. Jonas considered this, then stepped down onto the platform. Walter, unable to stop himself, rose and went to the window. The valley beyond the station was wide and golden, scattered with small white houses, low stone walls, and sheep that grazed with the peaceful stupidity of sheep everywhere. Yet there was something odd about the light. It did not seem like morning or evening. It was afternoon, perfectly afternoon, held in place. Jonas walked away from the platform, his unlit lantern swinging at his side. With every step he took, the valley changed. The grass grew longer, the sky deepened. A sea appeared at the far edge of the hills, silver blue beneath the sun. Then a lighthouse rose from a cliff that had not been there moments before. Walter heard Agnes whisper, "Oh." The lighthouse stood tall and white against the sky. At its base a small cottage leaned into the wind. A woman in a yellow shawl waited by the gate. Jonas stopped. Even from the train, Walter could see the stillness in him. "That must be his unfinished thing," said Milo. Walter glanced down. The boy's compass had stopped spinning. Its needle pointed straight towards the lighthouse. Jonas walked on. The woman at the gate did not move until he reached her. Then she raised one hand and touched his cheek. Jonas bowed his head. The lantern in his hand flickered, once, twice. Then it filled with warm gold light. A breeze passed over the valley. The sheep lifted their heads. The sea flashed. Somewhere, though Walter could not see where, a bell began to ring. The conductor closed the carriage door. "Is that all?" Walter asked. "We just leave him?" The conductor looked at the valley. Some passengers must meet what they missed without an audience. But will he return? If he is ready. That is another slippery answer. It is a slippery journey. The whistle blew. The train began to move. Walter watched Jonas grow smaller on the platform, standing now with the woman in the yellow shawl, his lantern glowing between them. Then the mist folded over the window, and the valley was gone. For several minutes nobody spoke. Agnes tied and untied the ribbon around her letters. Elspeth closed her violin case. Milo stared at his compass, which had begun to tremble again. Walter wrote, "First stop, Jonas Reed, lantern lit. Loss perhaps not a place, but an afternoon never properly finished." He paused, then added, "Must not stare too hard at other people's grief. It is not museum glass." The words came out before he had thought them through. He wondered whether Eleanor would have approved. The train travelled on. The mist darkened slightly, turning from pearl to pewter. Shadows moved within it. Not creatures exactly, but shapes of things almost seen. A school desk, a bicycle wheel, a window left open in rain, a birthday cake with one candle blown out too soon. Walter leaned back. "Has anyone," he said, considered that this train might be deeply intrusive? Elspeth Vale smiled faintly. Most healing is. That does not make it polite. No, she said, but it makes it necessary. The conductor passed through the carriage again. Next stop, Whistlewood. Elspeth's face changed. Her fingers tightened over the case. Walter watched her carefully, though not too carefully. He had only just warned himself about museum glass. The mist cleared again. This time, the train entered a forest. Tall trees rose on either side, their trunks silver-white and their leaves dark green. The branches were hung with hundreds of tiny wooden whistles, each carved in a different shape: birds, boats, foxes, stars, shoes, leaves, houses, hands. They turned gently in the wind, but none of them made a sound. The platform was narrow and made of dark planks. Its sign read, Whistlewood. The train stopped. Elspeth stood. I made something once, she said quietly, and then I refused to finish it. Milo frowned. A violin? A violin for my brother. She touched the case. He said the first note played on it would be enough. I told him that was sentimental nonsense. Was it? Walter asked. Elspeth looked at him. At the time, I thought so. The conductor opened the door. Elspeth stepped down. As she walked into the wood, the whistles turned towards her, still silent. She reached a clearing where a workbench stood beneath the trees. On it lay the body of a violin, golden brown and waiting. The unfinished scroll from her case rose gently into the air and settled into place at the top of the instrument. Elspeth put one hand to her mouth. A man appeared beside the bench. He was thin, laughing-eyed, and wrapped in a scarf far too long for him. Walter felt his own fingers move towards the vintage scarf tucked at his collar, the one he often wore in colder weather and had brought today without quite meaning to. The man in the clearing lifted the violin. Elspeth shook her head. Then, slowly, she took the bow from the workbench. The first note was small, very small. It floated through Whistlewood and touched every carved whistle at once. The forest answered, not loudly, not as music exactly, more like breath becoming melody. Bird-shaped whistles sang like birds. Boat-shaped whistles gave low wooden hums. The star-shaped ones chimed high and clear, and the tiny houses made a sound like doors opening in warm rooms. Agnes began to cry silently into her handkerchief. Milo looked away, embarrassed by tenderness. Walter did not look away. Elspeth played only a few bars. Then she lowered the bow, and the man in the scarf kissed her forehead. The conductor stepped back into the carriage. Time, he said. Elspeth returned as the train began to breathe steam once more. She sat down, holding the completed violin in her lap. The case, Walter noticed, was now empty. Are you all right? He asked. No, said Elspeth. Then, after a moment, she added, but less unfinished. Walter nodded. That may be as much as anyone can sensibly aim for before supper. Elspeth smiled properly then. The train moved on. Walter wrote, "Whistlewood, unfinished violin. Music carried apology better than words. Must remember, not every silence is peaceful. Some are waiting to be played." The next stretch of journey seemed longer. The lamps dimmed. The upholstery looked darker. Rain appeared on the windows, though there was no sky outside, only mist. Droplets slid upwards instead of down. Agnes Plover whispered, "It will be me next." No one contradicted her. The conductor did not need to announce it. The train began to slow before he entered. Outside, the mist parted to reveal a station made almost entirely of doors. They stood upright without walls, in rows and rows across a flat grey plain. Some were grand front doors with brass knockers. Some were kitchen doors with peeling paint. Some were tiny cupboard doors. Some were letterbox flaps, standing on little legs like nervous animals. A sign hung from a crooked post. "The sorting office of unsent things." Agnes gave a shudder. "That is not on the timetable," Walter said. "It is for her," said Elspeth. Agnes rose, clutching the bundle of letters. "I didn't steal them," she said suddenly. "I didn't. They were never properly addressed, or they were returned, or the person had moved away, or died, or didn't want to be found." Walter kept his voice gentle. "And yet you kept them." Agnes looked down. "I thought someone ought to." The conductor opened the carriage door. The moment Agnes stepped onto the platform, the doors began to knock. Tap, 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 tap. Letterboxes opened and closed. Hinges creaked. Names appeared on envelopes in Agnes's bundle, glowing faintly blue. She walked into the rows of doors. One by one she slid letters through the correct openings. As each letter passed through, something happened. Behind one door, a young woman laughed through tears. Behind another, an old man sat up in bed and whispered a name. Behind a third, two children looked at a photograph they had never seen before. Walter could not see everything clearly. The doors showed only glimpses, brief and private. Agnes moved faster. Her bundle grew smaller. At last, only one envelope remained. It was pale green. Agnes held it against her chest for a long time. The door before her was ordinary. Blue paint, brass letterbox, a scuffed step, a pot of dead lavender beside it. "No," Agnes whispered. The conductor stood very still. Walter watched from the train, hardly breathing. Agnes lifted the envelope. Her hand shook. Then she pushed it through the letterbox. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. A younger version of Agnes stood inside, wearing the same red cardigan, though brighter then, less faded. Beside her stood a man with kind eyes and a suitcase in his hand. The younger Agnes held the green letter unopened. The older Agnes covered her face. The man in the doorway said something Walter could not hear. Agnes answered. The younger Agnes opened the letter. A wind moved across the grey plain, lifting every envelope, every scrap of paper, every old address and forgotten stamp into the air. They became white birds, hundreds of them, thousands. They rose above the doors and flew into the mist. Agnes returned to the train without the bundle. She looked smaller somehow, but not weaker. Walter stood to let her pass. She sat by the window and folded the empty blue ribbon into a square. "I was afraid one letter could change everything," she said. Walter waited. "It did," she said. "Just later than it should have." The train began to move. Walter wrote, "Agnes Plover. Letters delivered. Fear is a poor postman. Keeps everything back and calls it safety." Milo read the line upside down. "That's good," he said. Walter closed the notebook slightly. "Spying is unattractive. I'm observing. I invented observing before you were born. My compass says otherwise." The compass needle had stopped spinning again. This time it pointed not out of the window, but straight at Walter. Walter felt suddenly cold. Milo noticed. "It's been doing that for a while," he said. Walter looked away. "Nonsense, it's broken." "Maybe," said Milo, "but it keeps finding you." The conductor appeared. "Next stop," he said. "The junction of Almost." Milo went pale. The train slowed. Outside, tracks appeared in every direction. Hundreds of them, crossing, dividing, curving away into mist. Signals glowed red, amber, green, blue, and colors Walter did not have names for. Platforms stood at impossible angles. Footbridges led nowhere and everywhere. Clocks showed different times, each one nearly right. At the center was a small platform with a crooked sign. The junction of Almost Milo stood, gripping his brass compass. "I built it for a competition," he said. The compass. It was supposed to guide people to what they needed most. But I couldn't make it work. I changed the design, then changed it again, then smashed it. "Why?" asked Walter. "Because someone else won." "Ah," said Walter. Milo looked at him sharply. "What does "ah" mean?" "It means adults recognize foolishness, because we have usually tried it first." Milo stepped onto the platform. The signals changed. On one track, Walter saw Milo older, standing in a grand workshop. On another, Milo sat alone beside piles of abandoned machines. On a third, he was laughing with friends over a table covered in sketches. On a fourth, he walked away from invention altogether, hands in his pockets. The boy turned round and round, overwhelmed. The compass in his hand spun wildly. Then Walter saw what Milo did not. At the edge of the platform sat a very small machine made from springs, copper wire, and a cracked watch face. It clicked sadly to itself. Milo noticed it at last. He crouched. "That was my first," he whispered. "I made it when I was 7. "What does it do?" Walter called, before remembering perhaps he shouldn't interfere. Milo looked back. "It finds the way home." "Useful," said Walter. Milo took the little machine in both hands. The broken compass opened like a flower. Its pieces rearranged themselves, folding around the small childhood invention. Brass, spring, glass, and wire settled into a new shape. The needle stopped spinning. It pointed straight ahead. Not towards any of the grand tracks, towards the carriage, towards Milo himself. The boy laughed once, a startled sound. Then he ran back to the train as the signals turned green. When he sat down, the compass lay quiet in his palm. "What did it find?" Walter asked. Milo looked embarrassed. "Me." "A difficult destination," said Walter. The train departed the junction of Almost. The mist closed in again, but this time it seemed thinner. The lamps brightened. Agnes slept. Elspeth tuned her violin in tiny, careful movements. Jonas had not returned, but Walter felt somehow that he had reached where he needed to be. Milo's compass rested on the table between them. After a while its needle shifted. Once again it pointed at Walter. No spinning now, just a steady, certain line. Walter stared at it. The conductor entered and checked his silver watch. "There is one stop remaining before the terminus." Walter didn't like the way he said that. "And what is the terminus?" he asked. The conductor looked at him. "The quiet mile." Walter's notebook warmed in his pocket. Outside, the mist began to clear. For the first time since boarding, Walter saw a road. A narrow lane bordered by hedges, wet leaves, a familiar stone wall, a gate with peeling green paint. His gate, his lane, his house. But not as it was now, as it had been. Light shone in the kitchen window. Warm, yellow, alive. Walter could almost smell toast. The conductor stood beside him. "Mr. Bramble," he said softly, "your stop is next." Walter said nothing. He watched the house draw nearer through the glass. On the kitchen windowsill a small brown notebook lay open beside a jar of marmalade, and in the glow beyond the window someone moved. Walter pressed one hand against the glass. The train slowed. Ahead, a sign appeared out of the mist. The Quiet Mile. And for the first time that evening, Walter Bramble was not curious at all. He was afraid. Chapter 3. The Last Ticket. The train slowed, as if it had suddenly remembered how heavy it was. For the first time since leaving platform 13.5, the Resolute Sparrow began to rattle. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a gentle clack beneath the floorboards, the sort Walter remembered from childhood journeys when sandwiches were wrapped in greaseproof paper and his father carried the tickets in the inside pocket of his coat. Clack, 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 clack. The sound made everything worse. Mystery was easier when it behaved mysteriously. But this felt ordinary, familiar, close enough to touch. Outside the window, the narrow lane beside Walter's house ran through soft evening rain. The hedges were clipped lower than they were now. The front gate still had green paint on it. A bicycle leaned against the wall, and 2 terracotta pots stood by the door, full of geraniums. Walter knew those pots. He had broken one of them years later while trying to carry a ladder and wave at Mrs. Hobbs at the same time. It had been, even by his standards, over-ambitious. The kitchen window glowed. A figure moved beyond the glass. Walter sat very still. Milo's compass lay on the little table between them, its needle pointing straight at him. Agnes Plover slept with the empty blue ribbon in her hand. Elspeth Vale had her completed violin resting across her lap, one hand curved over it protectively. The conductor stood in the aisle, his silver watch closed in his palm. "No," Walter said. The conductor did not answer. Walter looked up. "I have seen enough impossible stations for one evening." "Quite possibly," said the conductor. "Then we can continue to the next one." "There is no next one for you." "That sounds administratively final." "It is not administration, Mr. Bramble. It is invitation." The train eased beside a small platform. It was not grand. It was hardly a platform at all. A strip of wet stone beside the lane. A single lamp. A wooden bench. No ticket office, no timetable, no refreshments, which Walter had by now concluded was a deliberate pattern of neglect. The sign was plain. The Quiet Mile. Walter stared at it. That is not a station. Few important places are at first glance. I dislike that answer. I know. The carriage door opened. Cold, rain-scented air entered, carrying with it the smell of wet leaves, coal smoke, and toast. Toast. Walter closed his eyes. For a moment he was back in his own kitchen many years ago, listening to Eleanor hum while she scraped butter too vigorously across a slice of bread, because she had always believed toast should be taken seriously. He opened his eyes. "I don't want to go out there," he said. Milo looked at him. The boy's face had lost its restless cleverness. He simply looked young. "You don't have to, do you?" Walter turned to the conductor. "Do I?" "No one is forced to step off." Walter exhaled slowly. "Well, good. But no passenger leaves this train unchanged. If you do not step off here, you may carry the mile with you." Walter looked towards the platform. "What mile?" "The one you never walked." That was when he understood. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. The conductor stepped aside. Walter rose. His knees made no complaint this time, which he found suspicious and not entirely welcome. He took his notebook from his pocket. Eleanor's handwriting waited at the top of the page. "There are journeys that begin long before the road appears." Walter touched the words with one finger, then he stepped down onto the quiet mile. The rain was gentle. It landed on his cap, his shoulders, and the back of his hands with the delicate persistence of someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. The train waited behind him, breathing steam. Ahead stood his old gate. No, not his old gate. Their old gate. Walter walked towards it. Every step changed the evening slightly. The lane became younger, the cracks in the wall mended. The ivy drew back. The brass door knocker brightened. The geraniums lifted their heads, red and cheerful and entirely unaware of future ladders. At the gate, Walter stopped. The kitchen window was open a little at the top. From inside came Eleanor's voice. "Walter, is that you making weather noises?" His throat tightened. For a moment he could not answer. The back door opened. Eleanor stood there in her green cardigan, one hand still holding the butter knife. She looked exactly as she had on an ordinary evening long ago. Hair pinned loosely, reading glasses hanging from a chain, a smudge of flour on one sleeve, though Walter knew perfectly well she had not baked anything that day and had never explained where the flour came from. She smiled. "There you are," she said. "You look like a man who has misplaced Thursday." Walter gripped the gate. "Eleanor." "Well, don't stand in the rain looking tragic. Come in before the toast gets ideas." He could not move. She studied him more closely. "Oh," she said softly. "It's that sort of visit." Walter looked down at his hands. "They brought me here." "Who did?" "A train." "That would be your explanation." "It is quite a train, I'm sure." "And there was a lighthouse keeper, and a violin maker, and a postmistress with letters, and a boy with a compass." Eleanor nodded, as though this were a perfectly ordinary list of dinner guests. "Were there biscuits?" "No. Poor organization." "I said much the same." She smiled. The warmth of it nearly broke him. Walter looked past her into the kitchen. The table was set for two. The notebook lay by the marmalade jar. His chair was pulled out slightly, as if waiting. "This isn't real," he said. Eleanor tilted her head. "Real is a more elastic word than people admit." "I can't stay." "No." "You know that?" "I suspected." The rain ticked softly in the leaves. Walter swallowed. "What is this place?" Eleanor set the butter knife down on the little table by the door. "I think it is the part of the road you didn't walk." He shut his eyes. He remembered then. Not the large grief, not the day of the funeral, not the silence of the house afterwards, with cups standing where she had left them and her library books still stacked beside the chair. This was smaller, crueler because it was smaller. A week before she died, Eleanor had asked him to walk with her to the old railway bridge after tea. It was only a mile, there and back. She had said the evening light would be beautiful over the fields. Walter had said no, not sharply, not unkindly. He had been tired. There had been marking to finish, a drawer to repair, something ordinary and forgettable. He had said, tomorrow, perhaps. Tomorrow had become hospital corridors, then silence, then years. He had remembered grand things, birthdays, holidays, arguments, laughter, the way she tapped book spines when choosing what to read. But that small, unfinished walk had remained in him like a stone in a shoe he had learned to limp around. "I should have gone," he said. Eleanor stepped through the doorway and came down the path. "Yes," she said. Walter looked at her. She took his hand. The shock of it was not ghostly. It was warm. "But you were tired," she said, "and human. And you did not know it would matter." "I should have known everything with you mattered. That is far too much responsibility for any one Tuesday." "It was a Thursday." "Was it?" "I believe so." "Then far too much responsibility for any one Thursday." Walter gave a broken laugh. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Walk with me now." He looked back at the train. The conductor stood on the platform. Milo watched from the carriage window. Elspeth had raised her violin but did not play. Agnes was awake now, her hand pressed to her mouth. Walter turned back. "Yes," he said. "I think I can manage a mile." They walked, not quickly, not with urgency, along the lane, past the gate, beneath the dripping hedges. The world around them was held in that impossible evening. Birds murmured in the trees. A puddle reflected a sky that had no stars yet. Somewhere nearby, someone burned leaves, and the smoke drifted low and blue. Eleanor slipped her arm through his. "You've grown thinner," she said. "You always said I was too fond of biscuits." "You were." "I have reduced my intake." "By how much?" "A private amount." She gave him a look. "Walter." "Not enough to alarm anyone." They walked on. The lane bent towards the old railway bridge. Walter knew every inch of it. The cracked milestone, the field gate that never closed properly, the hawthorn tree shaped like a badger if viewed generously from the left. Eleanor stopped beside the bridge. Beyond it, the fields opened into long, wet grass and silver evening light. It was beautiful. Of course it was. She had been right. She was frequently right, which Walter had found both comforting and inconvenient. They stood side by side. "I missed this," he said. "You missed one walk." "I missed the last walk." "You didn't know." "No. But I have carried it as though I did." Eleanor looked out across the fields. "Grief is strange," she said. "It will ignore mountains and trip over a teacup." Walter nodded. "I didn't open the attic box." "I know." "I couldn't." "I know. And sometimes I talk to your notebook as if it might answer." "Does it?" "Occasionally. In your handwriting." "That sounds like me." He took the notebook from his pocket. The rain did not mark its pages. Eleanor looked at it, her expression softening. "You kept it?" "Of course." "And filled it with nonsense?" "Observations." "Nonsense with boots on, then?" He smiled. "I didn't know whether going on without you was disloyal." Eleanor turned to him fully. "There it is." "What?" "The unfinished thing." Walter looked down. "I thought it was the walk." "The walk was only where it hid." The fields shimmered. The rain slowed until each drop seemed to hang in the air. Eleanor placed her hand against his cheek. "Walter Bramble, you are allowed to keep living." He could not answer. "You may go to libraries," she said. "You may board ridiculous trains. You may notice damp brickwork and argue with conductors. You may laugh. You may be happy in rooms where I am not. That is not betrayal." Walter closed his eyes. "I don't know how." "No," she said, "but you have always been better at beginning than admitting you have begun." The whistle sounded in the distance, soft, patient. Eleanor looked towards it. "Time," she said. "No." "Yes." The word was gentle but final. Walter held her hand tighter. "I don't want to lose you again." "You are not losing me again. You are leaving a room where I cannot stay." The whistle came once more. Walter took a breath. The fields blurred. The bridge, the lane, the wet hedges, Eleanor's green cardigan, the smell of toast from the open kitchen window, all of it trembled like a reflection touched by rain. Eleanor took the notebook and turned to a blank page. With the pencil Walter kept tucked in the spine, she wrote one line. Then she handed it back. "Read it later," she said. "I hate later." "No, you don't. You live there." He laughed through tears. She kissed his cheek. "Go on, Walt." The lane began to fold into mist. Walter stepped backwards. Eleanor stood by the bridge, one hand raised. He wanted to say something grand, something worthy, something that would hold all the years, all the small mornings and ordinary suppers, all the things he had not said at the right time. But Walter Bramble was, in the end, an honest man. So he said, "Thank you for the walk." Eleanor smiled. About time. The mist closed. Walter found himself back on the platform of the quiet mile. The conductor stood beside the open carriage door. Walter climbed aboard. No one spoke as he returned to his seat. Milo looked down at his compass. The needle had stopped pointing at Walter. It now rested calmly towards the front of the train. Agnes offered him her folded handkerchief. Walter accepted it. "It is clean," she said. "Mostly." "Mostly is generous enough," said Walter. Elspeth lifted her violin and played 4 quiet notes. They sounded like rain clearing from leaves. The train moved on. Walter opened the notebook. On the blank page, Eleanor had written, "Do not spend the rest of the story rereading the last chapter." Walter read it 3 times. Then he closed the notebook and held it against his chest. The conductor came through the carriage. "Final stop," he said. "Platform 13.5. The mist outside brightened. The passengers gathered their things, though each now carried less than before. Agnes had only her blue ribbon, Elspeth her finished violin, Milo his compass, Walter his notebook, which somehow felt lighter. The train slowed beneath the glass roof of the hidden platform. The clock read 7:17. Walter frowned. That cannot be right. The conductor checked his watch. It usually is. But we left at 7:17. Yes. And have travelled for hours. In one sense. In the useful sense? Not especially. Walter sighed. Timekeeping on this service is decorative. The conductor handed back Walter's ticket. The words had changed. Walter Bramble journey completed valid for return to ordinary life. Walter looked at it for a long moment. Will I remember? Enough. Will the others? Enough. And Jonas? The conductor looked towards the mist at the end of the platform. A warm golden light glowed there briefly, like a lantern carried into a safe harbour. Walter nodded. Good. He stepped down. The other passengers followed. Agnes gave him a firm nod. Elspeth touched the brim of an imaginary hat. Milo held out his hand. Walter shook it. "Look after the compass," he said. Milo smiled. "It finds what I need most now." "Unfortunate. That may include homework." Milo looked horrified. The conductor blew his whistle. The passengers faded one by one into their own evenings, each carrying a little less sorrow and a little more courage. Walter remained on the platform. "Will the train come again?" he asked. The conductor stepped back into the carriage. "When it is needed? By me? Perhaps. By someone else? Certainly." The engine gave a soft hiss. Walter touched the side of the locomotive. "Resolute Sparrow," he said. "A better name than I first thought." The engine released a pleased puff of steam. Then the train moved away into the mist, carriages glowing, brass lamps shining, whistle fading, until it became no more than a note in memory. Walter climbed the blue-lit steps and emerged through the narrow archway beside the abandoned station. Rain fell on the town, ordinary rain, properly vertical. The brass sign above the archway had vanished. Walter walked back to the library. The green door was still unlocked. Inside, Mrs. Finch was at the desk, turning off the lamps one by one. She looked up. "Good evening, Mr. Bramble." Walter removed his cap. "Mrs. Finch, did you find what you were looking for?" "No," she smiled. "Did you find what you needed?" Walter considered this. "I found a train with inadequate catering, several impossible stations, a conductor addicted to slippery answers, and a mile I should have walked years ago." "That sounds productive." "It was upsetting." "Useful things often are." Walter placed the blue railway book on the desk. The timetable was inside it again, cream card, faded ink, perfectly harmless. Mrs. Finch took the book but did not shelve it. "Will you be borrowing anything else?" she asked. Walter looked towards the travel section. "Not tonight." "Very wise." He turned to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Finch?" "Yes." "Do you ever ride the train?" Her spectacles flashed in the lamplight. "Librarians have their own routes." Walter decided this was exactly the sort of answer she would give. Outside, the rain had softened. He walked home slowly, not because he was tired, but because he was practicing. At his gate, he stopped. The green paint was long gone now. The geranium pots were gone too. The wall was cracked where time had leaned on it, but the house was lit. His house, his life. Walter went inside. He made toast. He buttered it carefully. He opened a jar of marmalade, considered it, and then closed it again because some adventures need not be repeated immediately. He sat at the kitchen table and opened Eleanor's notebook. Below her line, and below the sentence she had written on the quiet mile, Walter added his own. "Today I learned that unfinished journeys do not always ask us to go backwards. Sometimes they ask us to come home differently." He tapped the pencil against his chin. Then he added, "Also, always question any train with no biscuit trolley." The house seemed very quiet, but not empty. The next morning Mrs. Finch shelved the blue book in the far corner of the library. For a long while it sat undisturbed among the old travel guides and forgotten railway histories. Then, near closing time, a woman came in out of the rain. She wore a yellow scarf and carried a shopping bag full of apples. She said she wanted something about journeys, but not the usual sort. Mrs. Finch looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled and pointed towards the back shelves. "Third shelf," she said. "Blue cloth cover, no title on the spine." The woman found the book. When she opened it, a cream timetable slipped out and landed carefully at her feet. Across the top, in elegant blue-grey lettering, were the words, "Departures for unlisted stations," and near the bottom, printed in fresh ink, "One destination waited. Platform 13.5, 7:17 p.m. One way until returned." The woman stared. Somewhere far away, or perhaps very near, a steam whistle sounded, and the next journey began.